greenhouse gas emissions to meet the 1.5 Paris temperature goal. Greenhouse gas emissions need to halve by 2030 and reach net zero by shortly after mid-century. What we're going to discuss today is some of the details of how far we're going in our progress towards that and what needs to happen. First of all, we're going to look into who's doing what in terms of the NDCs. Are there countries that are meeting those targets that they've set for themselves, or are there others that are lagging behind? We'll then look at the connections between those NDCs and long-term strategies. Are these different commitments that countries make consistent, or are there missing pieces that still need to be filled? National targets and actions are really important, but it's also really helpful to look at sectors and different sectoral actions. This helps us to understand some of the technical and the economic challenges that we're facing, and hopefully solutions and collaborations that we can get to overcome those. Today we're going to dive into that by looking at the steel sector in particular with some of my colleagues from New Climate. Our session today is split into two sections. My colleagues are already on the stage with me now. We'll talk a bit about those national targets, and then we'll move on to a second set. We're going to be using Slido for a Q&A session after a couple of presentations. And we'd really like it if you were to add some of your questions to the Slido. You've got a QR code in front of you now that you can use, or you can scroll down in the web browser and you'll find a link. Please do add those questions, and we look forward to answering them as well. With that, I'd like to introduce my first two speakers here. I have with me today Michel den Elzen and Janus Daphnomelis, both of them from the Netherlands Environment Agency, or PBL. Michel den Elzen is a senior climate policy analyst at PBL and also a professor at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Free University in Amsterdam. He's provided climate policy advice and support to European and Dutch delegations, including the European Commission DG Klima, and for the UNFCCC climate negotiations. In addition to his extensive collection of scientific papers, he's been a lead and contributing author to multiple IPCC assessment reports and has led the UNEP GAP report since its inception. And we're very privileged to have him here with us today. Joining us as well is Janus. He holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from TU Delft in the Netherlands and is now a researcher at PBL with Michel. There he's developing climate change mitigation scenarios and models action and policies being taken to meet global and national mitigation targets. First of all, Michel, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Okay.
And hopefully we can see those slides.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gas mitigation scenarios for major emitting countries, the analysis of the current and climate policies and mitigation commitments 2022 update. It's a recent report. It's being finalized by a group of authors from the New Climate Institute and from PBL, Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, and also from EASA. So the aim of this study is to assess the 25 major emitting countries' progress towards their previous and updated NDC targets, and to investigate how annual emissions rates compare across countries. For the method, we are focusing on 25 countries that are responsible for 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the analysis of the current climate and energy policies, taking into account all the policies up to June 2022. And we use two models. One model is the Climate Action Tracker from the New Climate Institute, and the second is the Image Integrated Assessment Model from the PBL. And what's new in this study, first of all, of course, are the current policies, but also the updated NDCs and the net zero targets. This is new. The report can be downloaded from our website. And now we moved directly to the main findings of this report. So first of all, the emissions under the current policy by 2030 remain above 2050 levels for most countries analyzed. So for about 60 countries, it's above 2050 levels. We see the emission projections from a decrease of 40% to an increase of 70% between 2015 and 2030. There are a couple of countries that have emissions below 2050 levels, like UK, the US, and also Japan. and also Australia, and there are also a couple of countries for United States. It's important to say that we do not take into account the Inflation Reduction Act, so the reduction is now 20% below 2050 levels. But if we would take it into account, then the projection would be even much lower than that. It's also important to know that if you look at the full group of these 25 countries, the emissions as a group are about 4% below 2019 levels and 11% above 2019 levels. So that's not enough to meet the 1.5 degree target, because therefore we need a reduction of at least 43%. The next is about whether countries are on track or not to meet their latest NDC targets. So there's a group of countries that are on track to meet their latest NDC targets. As listed here, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, Turkey and Vietnam, for example. Well, it's important to note that this study does not assess the ambition of the NDC. So a country that is on track to meet this target, that could be because it has a less ambitious NDC target. And a country that is not on track, yeah, it could also be that they have set a very ambitious NDC target. So that's the reason why they are not on track. And so we are just looking at what are the NDC targets and what are the policies, and are these policies enough to meet their NDC targets. So another reason why the number is rather low is because of the NDC updates. There are a couple of countries that have raised their ambitions, and now the NDC target is more ambitious, and therefore they are not on track. It's also a group of countries that have an NDC target, which is basically not very ambitious. If we look at the current policy projections, these are far below the NDC targets. So actually they are achieving the NDC targets rather easy. And if you look at the total number, then we basically see for Vietnam, Iran, Ethiopia, India and Turkey, the NDC target is well above their current policy projection. Then we move to a group of countries. What they have done, they were achieving their previous NDC target, but right now they are not achieving their most updated NDC targets anymore, because they have used their ambition raising cycle to set themselves more ambitious targets, like the EU did, and for that reason they are not on track to meet their updated NDC targets. So these are Argentina, Australia, Europe, Japan and South Africa. There's also a group of countries that have set themselves a target, and they were not achieving their previous NDC target, but also not the most recent one, their updated one. So for example, for the United States, they have updated the NDC targets. They were not achieving their previous NDC targets, but they are also not achieving their current updated NDC target. So they really need to adopt more sufficient policies in order to be on track for their most recent NDC targets. Then we move to the per capita emission levels, and there we have this figure for the 25 countries. So basically the per capita emission levels under the NDC targets indicated in purple, and under the current policy scenarios blue, and grey is the historical emissions of 2005. And this figure basically shows that there are a wide range of per capita emission levels. There is a group of countries that have a rather high per capita emissions on the upper end of the figure, like Saudi Arabia, Iran and United Arab Emirates. They have even a per capita emission level for the current policy projection that is about twice as high the world average. And then there's a group of countries like on the bottom, India, Morocco, Ethiopia. They have projected per capita emission levels that remain even 2 times below today's levels. In general, what we see that even if all the countries implement their unconditional NDC targets, that we still have the situation that there are quite some differences across the per capita emission levels across the different countries. So these differences remain relevant even under the adoption of all NDC targets. Then we move to the last part, and it's basically about the change in the rates in the greenhouse gas emissions. So we look at these 25 countries, and the first 4 columns indicate the emission reduction rates for the period 2010-2019. There we see basically an emission growth average of 0.9% per year. for the countries analyzed, and quite a range of emission rates. Then we see the current policy projections. That's the average is 1.8%. Then we see for the NDC emissions, there we see the range, very wide range from minus 3.6% towards 5.5%. Then most of these countries actually have a net zero target, and in order to get there from the 2030 levels, countries need to reduce their emissions quite a lot. It's about, on average, 4.1%. Then we move to the different dots, and the yellow and orange dots indicate basically the dots for the directions for the NDC targets. The blues are basically the historical rates and the current policy situation. And on the reds is basically the net zero targets. And basically we see three groups of countries. The first group of countries, there we see that the unconditional NDC do not drive additional efforts. There are large differences between the NDC targets and the current policy projections. Basically, these countries are achieving their NDC targets rather easily based on current policies, such as Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Then there's the second group of countries, and there we see that the NDC really require additional policies in order to get to the NDC targets, such as Argentina, Australia, Japan, South Africa, and Europe. And then there's the third group of countries, and there we see quite a discrepancy between where we're heading for right now under the current policies and where we need to be in order to get to the NDC targets, but also in order to get to the net zero target. And there we see quite a difference between the blue dots and the red and the orange dots at the end. For example, for South Korea, United States, Canada, and Brazil, they really have to accelerate their policies in order to get to the NDC targets, but also to get to the net zero targets. I will leave it here. I give it now to Janus for his presentation.
Thank you, Michel and Luis. So, good afternoon from me as well. I will be presenting the work we have been doing in PBL on national and global net zero pathways. As an introduction, during the COP in Glasgow last year, there were a lot of new net zero target announcements from major countries that are a significant development in countries accepting the responsibility in climate action and providing a long-term pathway of emission reductions at a global level. So we wanted to examine how can we build upon these current promises in order to implement the overall goals of the Paris Agreement. And we came up with three simple propositions that together, taken all together, could align the current pledges and the Paris Agreement goals. The first one is actual implementation of these current net zero pledges. What happens, what impacts does a full implementation have? The second one is aligning current NDC pledges with these net zero pledges. In many cases, in many countries, their NDC targets are above their net zero pathways. So aligning them would provide the confidence that the net zero targets can actually be met. And finally, our contribution is broadening net zero pledges from countries that currently have announced one to all countries on a global level, in order to see if that gets us closer to a 1.5 degree actually. And we will be also investigating the impacts on national sectoral emissions. A brief overview of our scenario narrative. We have a current policy scenario where basically it's an implementation of current national climate policies. An NDC scenario where we assume full achievement of all NDC targets from countries. Our net zero scenario where we achieve the NDC targets in 2030 and then move linearly to a net zero target per country. Our aligned net zero scenario where we skip the NDC target basically and move straight to net zero from 2022 onwards, with the exception of lower and low income countries that we allow target towards their NDC targets and then dropping to the net zero pathway. And finally, our broadening scenario where we assign a net zero target to all countries based on their income per capita. And we compare all this with an illustrative 1.5 degree scenario developed in IMAGE, which is one of the scenarios used also for the IPCC report this year. If we have a look at the global greenhouse gas projections and temperature increase, we can see that implementing the NDC targets, the green line in our graph, reduces emissions by 25% compared to the trajectory we're on now by the end of this century. And then if we go one step further and actually implement all net zero targets, we can actually close 75% of the emissions gap to the 1.5 degree scenario, again by the end of the century. Now, between these our two net zero scenarios, if we align the NDCs with the net zero targets, we have the same emission levels by the end of the century, around 10 gigatons, as you can see in the graph, but we can achieve a lower temperature increase, basically because of lower cumulative emissions throughout the century. However, these two net zero scenarios also do not achieve global net zero in the end. By broadening our these net zero pledges to all countries, we can actually achieve greenhouse gas neutrality on a global scale by 2070, and this translates in a well below 2 degree scenario with a temperature increase around 1.7 degrees, basically. However, even that still has a 10% more emissions gap to close to 1.5 degree. And if we have a closer look at the sectoral emissions for on a global scale, you can see the progression throughout our scenarios. Implementing the NDCs has certain impact, but it's actually implementation of net zero targets that makes a real difference. For the aligned scenario, we can see that, like we mentioned before, we get to 10 gigatons of emissions on a global level, but then with broadening the targets, we can actually achieve global greenhouse gas neutrality by 2070. And of course, main contributors to that is negative emissions in the electricity sector and land use sector. And the residual emissions are basically attributed to non-CO2, so methane, N2O, and different F gases, which are proving hard to abate in all sectors. And if we look in more detail in results for the European Union, we can see that the EU, as well as certain countries that have a very ambitious NDCs, their NDC scenario actually is very close to their 1.5 degree scenario, and sometimes even slightly more ambitious. But it's still, again, electricity that is compensating for any residual emissions, and that non-CO2 emissions prove hard to abate in all scenarios. And if we have a quick look in the final energy in the industry sector, my colleagues from New Climate right after will go more in depth in this sector. We can see even under current policy and NDC scenarios, there is a massive electrification in industry, but fossil fuel use still remains quite high. However, with the implementation of net zero targets and broadening of net zero targets, most of this fossil fuel use actually, is complemented with carbon capture and storage, and also the final energy is reduced due to efficiency improvements. And the similar picture is true for EU. We see significant electrification, fossil fuels almost completely replaced with fossil fuel coupled with CCS. And also, at least for the European Union case, biomass coupled with CCS, BECCS, is important, mostly in the middle part of this century. Also, there's a market for hydrogen in between 2040 and 2060, which is attributed to higher costs of biomass at the same time, but lately disappears as biomass and BECCS gain a larger share. So, this was my presentation for today, and we can move on to questions, I guess. Louise.
Thank you very much, Janis and Michelle, for your presentations today. We now have a few minutes for a question and answer session. As I said at the start, if you do have a question that you would like to pose to either of these two, please do that. Add that to the Slido that we have. Either you can use this QR code to access it, or scroll down in your web browser, and there should be a link that you can access there. And you want to go to room B85 in order to be able to ask that question. We actually already have one or two in, so I would like to ask those to my colleagues here, if that's all right. So the first comment here is that we should align the NDCs with the net zero targets. That makes logical sense. But our failure to meet the net zero target is not due to a lack of information or ambition. I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but would either of you like to respond to, do you agree with this comment, or is there something that you see as, what is it that we're lacking?
I do agree that we should align indeed the NDCs with the net zero target. That's very good point, and it's very well taken. And of course, you also need to take into account the national circumstances and also the capabilities of countries to mitigate. So yes, it is an important point to take. It's something that we are also explored in the work Jan has presented. We also have the information on a country level, for at least for the major emitting countries, and what needs to be done. And there we indeed see that sometimes countries really need to accelerate their policies in order to get to net zero.
What Michel said, basically, indeed, aligning the targets is a first major step. But as the comment says, yeah, it's not that we're lacking information or ambition, but it's rather that we need to translate the information we get from global models, such as the image that we use in PBL, and translate them into national models, taking into account specific national circumstances. Usually, national models have much more detailed information on economic growth, population projections, and any other national circumstances that might provide even more context and support for national net zero targets.
Thank you both. I think the other comments we have at the moment are mostly comments. I would pose one question to you, Michel. That is, in your comparison of NDCs and current policies, you highlighted that some countries have been on track to meet their NDCs with current policies, but have then submitted more ambitious NDCs and are now no longer on track. Can you maybe talk a bit about whether you know of any processes within those countries to get back on track? Is there a hope that in next year's report we will see many more ticks?
Yeah, I hope so. It's well, that's what we noticed before the previous targets. There's quite a list of countries now that are achieving their previous NDC targets, and that list has been growing since the last report. But indeed, there are a couple of countries like Europe, for example, that have raised their ambition, and now they are not on track anymore to meet their 55% reduction target, but they are developing all kinds of new policies. And it's the Fit for 55, for example, that package. We do take into account the policies that have been adopted in our calculations, but of course there are still some policies that need to be developed, also for Europe, and then it's well possible that they will achieve their 55% reduction target. And that we also see for other countries as well, that they are adopting all kinds of new policies. So yeah, that's something for next year. We are not taking into account planned policies. We are just focusing on the current policies and only the ones that have been adopted.
Okay. So I hope in a year's time we can sit here again and you can tell us that more countries are back on track or have maybe even submitted more ambitious NDCs. Just one final question for you then, Yannis, maybe to follow on a bit from that, maybe from your country-specific analysis, what might be needed by some countries, either in terms of announcements or policies, a bit more specifically, to reach this gap between the current NDC scenario and the broader net zero scenario, or even the 1.5 scenario?
Yeah. So I would actually have to say that we saw already in our analysis, even broadening the targets to every single country does not get us close. It gets us up to a point, but we still need to do more. And I agree with the IPCC assessment that it is short-term mitigation that we should focus on. It is possible to reach net zero on a global level without actually using extensively CDR technologies, carbon dioxide removal technologies. But we need to move fast, and we need to drop emissions at a record pace, more than we have ever done before, more than the COVID impact, basically, for years, until a couple of decades at least, in order to get us to that point that we can safely say, yes, we can comfortably reach a net zero. And actually we did some analysis on that as well, which unfortunately there was no time to present here. But in order to move from the broadened scenario to actually reaching the 1.5 degree, would mean moving the net zero targets back 10 years on a global level. So that means each and every country reaching net zero 10 years earlier, 2040 for EU, 2040 for USA, etc. So that's quite a huge and a very ambitious step to claim.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
with that very strong message, I think, in terms of the action that needs to be taken, I'd like to bring this first half of our session to a close. Thank you both very much. We're going to take a short break while we switch out speakers on the stage here, and we'll be back with you very shortly. Welcome back, and thanks again for joining us for this COP27 side event. Joining me now in our studio here in Brussels, I have Maria José de Villafranca and Anna Nielsen, who are both colleagues of mine at New Climate Institute, and they're going to both give, again, a short presentation, and we'll have another Q&A session in which we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into the industry sector, in particular steel. Get your questions ready. We will have a Q&A session at the end after their presentations, and please do add them to the Slido. But just briefly to introduce these colleagues of mine. So Anna Nielsen has been with us for around 3 years. She's an expert in tracking global and non-state action, and particularly in the heavy industry sector. So we'll have some interesting insights for us today. She holds a master's in energy systems analysis from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And before joining New Climate, she also worked with WRI and REN 21. Maria is trained as a chemical engineer and also holds master's degrees in environmental science and technology and life sciences. She's been working with New Climate for 6 years now already, and where she's been leading especially analyses of national policies, including under the Climate Action Tracker project, which I hope many of you already know. She's currently evaluating actions by non-state actors in heavy industry and is going to share some of that work with us today. I'm quite excited to hear about the details of this work, so without further ado, I would pass you over to Anna, who's going to walk us through the state of climate action in the industry sector.
Thanks, Louise.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so as Louise mentioned, I will give you a bit of a presentation on our work in the industry sector, mainly from two of our publications, so one which was recently published and one which is soon to be published. So the State of Climate Action report is an annual report which is co-authored together by the Climate Action Tracker, World Resources Institute and the Bezos Earth Fund. In this report, we kind of track progress across 8 different sectors on the global level. And we do so by basically identifying and collecting historical data on 40 different indicators and kind of compare the historical rate of change to Paris-compatible benchmarks. And we do so to evaluate whether these indicators are either on track, off track, far off track, or even going in the wrong direction. And the kind of grim outlook in this year's report is that actually none of these 40 indicators are on track. So as I mentioned, I will focus here on the industry sector with a bit of a deep dive into the steel sector later. But just starting by looking here at the emissions in the industry sector. So industrial emissions are growing and have been doing so for quite a while. So in the last 30 years, industrial emissions grew faster than in any other sector. And today they make up about a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions. And when we think about decarbonizing the industry sector, we kind of divide it into 4 different shifts. These include reducing the demand for industrial products, improving the energy efficiency, electrifying industry coupled with the decarbonization of the electricity supply, and the commercialization of new solutions for cement, steel, and plastics. And I will here focus a bit more closely on the last shift. So I will skip this slide. And so one of the things that makes industry quite challenging to decarbonize is that we need, for some of the processes, we need very high temperatures to enable chemical reactions. And these chemical reactions generate process emissions. These process emissions can't be decarbonized simply by decarbonizing the energy supply. So this is why we need to develop new solutions. And steel, cement, and chemicals are, these processes generate substantial amounts of process emissions. And the demand for these materials also increase and have been doing so for quite a time. So if you look here, for instance, at the steel production globally, this has been rising quite rapidly the last 20 years or so, and that mainly driven by increased production in China. So these subsectors are commonly referred to as hard to abate. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it's not possible to decarbonize them, but there are some specific challenges when it comes to technological development and bringing these new solutions to the market, but also the long lifetime of these industrial plants. And so in the State of Climate Action report, we look at these, what we call, or we think about them as outcome indicators. And this basically means that they are the result of, or they're influenced by a set of different measures. So we look here, for instance, at the carbon intensity of cement and steel. We can see that cement, in the cement sector, the intensity is decreasing, but not sufficiently fast. In the steel sector, however, the intensity is actually increasing, so it's going in the wrong direction. So what we wanted to do here was to think about what other indicators are there that might influence these outcome indicators. So what is actually happening on the ground and what could kind of signal early transformation that maybe not is visible in these outcome indicators yet. And we did so in this other publication, which Maria will talk more about in a bit. Here we identified 3 key priority areas for steel decarbonization. And these include ceasing new investments in blast furnaces, innovate and commercialize deep reduction technologies, and enhance the recycling of scrap steel. And just to clarify a bit here on the first priority area, so blast furnace-based steel production is the most common way to produce steel today, and is also the most emissions-intensive production route. So this corresponds to about 70% of global steel production today. And the problem with this technology is that it's inherently reliant on coal. So the only way to significantly reduce emissions in this production route is through using carbon capture and storage. And if we look at the technology stock today, quite a big share, about 45%, is quite old and reaching their end of life. And this could kind of provide a window of opportunity for companies to, when they retire the blast furnaces, reinvest in technologies that are easier to decarbonize. But there's also a risk that if these technologies are not mature and available on the market, companies might invest in new blast furnaces and kind of create these carbon lock-in effects. And if we look a little bit closer into the first priority area, one of the indicators that we tracked here is the new added steel capacities and also the new steel capacities that are planned in the future. And we can see here that this is dominated by new blast furnace production. And this kind of signals a quite strong need for carbon capture and storage in the mid to long term. If we then also, with that in mind, look into the second priority area, here we tracked low carbon steel facilities that are planned to become operational. We can see there that the number of low carbon steel facilities are rising, which is a positive sign, but it's still not going sufficiently fast. But when we look into the particular technologies that are considered for these projects, we see a very strong preference for hydrogen-based steel, and this is very encouraging as we see this new technology that can produce zero-emission steel actually coming close to commercialization. But then on the other hand, we have a huge gap in terms of CCUS projects where we can see this strong need, right? But there are very few CCS projects in the pipeline. So these are some of the key findings from this indicator analysis. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
And thank you, Anna, for that insight. I'd like to then hand you over to Maria, who's going to take a bit of more of a deep dive, particularly into companies and corporate work in the steel sector.
Thank you, Louise and Anna. Thanks. Yeah, happy to share some of the insights that we will actually publish next week in our report. We've been working all over this year really intensely with Anna and other colleagues looking into how the steel sector, in particularly globally, has or not advanced. And we have three main components that we've looked at. Two of them, the first and the second, looking at the key areas out of what the recent literature tells us that should happen. And then the indicators that Anna already presented are really, really relevant. And I think also what it's a little bit newer is that we have looked into what the actual companies are doing. So we've seen that over, and this is what I'll be focusing a little bit more. So we've seen over the last years that a lot of corporates in particular, well, not only, but a lot of corporates have presented climate targets. So they want to reduce their emissions. They've seen the need. They are maybe responding to the calling of science that we need to reduce emissions. And we wanted to see how does this target look like and what could the potential emission reduction could be. So this analysis, we take a deeper look into the top 60 crude steel producers worldwide that together account for more than half of the steel production. In a first part, we really look at what the plans are like, so what the target years are, what kind of coverage they have, and then we try to quantify it, so in terms of emissions globally, what the potential is for the whole sector and whether they're on track or not to what science is telling us that should happen. So one of the main results that we found is that there are, from the 60 companies, less than half actually have a target, so 26 only out of the 60 targets. However, there's a lot of these companies, so the largest ones actually produce a lot of the steel, and we see what the percentage of the crude steel production is. Like these targets cover more than half, so that's already a good thing. And of course, China here has a very big focus because most of the steel producers are there. 23 of those 60 companies are in China. So interestingly here, we see that a lot of companies have net zero targets, so 15 of those and some have sort of these longer term targets, more looking into future, and also intermediate targets, and only have just one target. So I don't know if, 42% are covered by net zero targets, so 42% of the steel production. And then we also have added here the Chinese state-owned enterprises. While a lot of them do not really have targets, we know that because they're state-owned, they will be needed to be attained by the national targets, so we have quantified the national targets as part of this. So China has a target to achieve net carbon neutrality by 2060 and peak emissions by 2030. So this is what those 18 companies, how we quantify them. More interestingly, when we really take a deeper look into the companies we target and to see what their actual plans are to achieve the targets, we find that most of them actually do not have a plan to achieve the targets. So that's not very encouraging. And only 8 of the companies, so 8 out of the 26 out of the 60, do have comprehensive detailed plans. So they specify the timeline, they specify what technologies they might want to switch to, the measures, and also, very interestingly, highlight the challenges for the implementation. We had even a deeper look to link a little bit more on what level. So we know that companies have different types of mitigation, but we wanted to see if that mitigation will actually be in line with what decarbonization that it's needed. So for those companies that have a target, we actually looked in particular what measures they're planning to implement, and we've seen. I'll explain quickly that we have classified 3 different tiers for mitigations in terms of their potential reduction. So limited here means up to 30%, between 10 and 30% reduction. Moderate means around 65%, while deep emission reduction is around 95%. So deep emission reduction would be a bit in line with decarbonization, but here we see that only one measure is mentioned in the plans of corporates. So most of them are focusing on these limited emission reduction measures that are mostly focused on the shorter term. So if we have a little bit of a link with what Anna presented before, we see that here a lot of the companies mention CCUS as one of the measures, but we've seen that from following the driving indicators that there's not enough happening in terms of what's on the pipeline and projects actually being approved. So all these different measures are in different stages of development technologically, and it's interesting to see that there's a mismatch basically with what corporates are putting forward and what needs to happen. But interestingly, there's also 15 companies that are looking into hydrogen. So Anna also mentioned that that's very promising. We've seen very positive here, and it's aligning. And what it's a little bit worrying, and there will be more details needed, is that the companies that are explicitly mentioning offsets, they don't provide a lot of details on that. So it would be very interesting to see what kind of offsetting they have in mind. After we had this deeper look into what the targets are and whether they have plans or not to achieve, and what kinds of technologies and measures companies are considering, we calculated what the potential as a whole sector would be. And for these, we prepared an assessment. This will be also published in the next days as preprint and pre-reviewed paper where we do a bottom-up calculation of the reference scenario. We take different assumptions on how the different technology improvements could look like in terms of energy efficiency, the different production based on the IEA scenario and so forth. And here, interestingly, what we see here on the red band is what the target scenario is. So this is if all targets from all companies, steel companies, are achieved, and this is a very big if, and that's why we also have a range, then emissions would be potentially between 6 and 10% lower in 2030, and between 31 to 39% lower in 2050. And this is in comparison to that blue line there, so the baseline, the reference scenario. And yeah, I think this is quite encouraging, but of course there's a lot of assumptions there and a lot of ifs that if we have seen before, we know that companies have targets that are not really backed up by measures or plans, then it's likely that this will not be achieved. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting finding, but we will still see how this develops over time. And yeah, I think it will be nice if there's any questions, we'll be super happy to answer.
Thanks a lot, Maria, for that really insightful overview of everything that's going on. It's really interesting to see. Again, if you're watching online and if you have any questions for either Maria or for Anna, please do add those to the Slido that you can access. We'd be really grateful to hear your questions. I think we don't yet have any for those two speakers, although I hope they will come in the next few minutes. But maybe I can be cheeky and ask my colleagues some questions. Maybe first of all, to Anna, you showed that the emissions intensity in the steel sector has been increasing rather than decreasing in the last few years. That's obviously not a good thing to be hearing. Can you maybe explain a bit about why that is? Why we're not seeing maybe some improvements despite improvements to technology or efficiency improvements?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned this, the blast furnace route, which is the most emissions-intensive route, and I also showed you how China is kind of dominating the steel production globally. And what we saw in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic was that China had quite a lot of stimulus packages directed towards infrastructure development, and this basically spurred even more or increased production of their blast furnace-based steel production. So this kind of provoked this increase in the carbon intensity. Mm-hmm. What we see though is that this is kind of going down again. So we might be expecting that the carbon intensity might be decreasing in the next few years, hopefully.
That's good to hear, and yeah, I hope in the next year's State of Climate Action report we can report that it's heading back at least in the right direction.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks. Maria, I had a question for you about the targets. So you said that some of the targets have been announced and you looked through all the details, but many of them didn't really have much detail in terms of how they would be implemented. I was wondering if some of these plans are quite recent and maybe we can hope or expect to see some of those details emerge, or are you not so hopeful there? Maybe you can talk to us a bit about the dynamics in terms of announcements by companies.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I mean, this is the first time we do this kind of exercise, and we're intending to continue doing that over time. So maybe next time we will have like a clear trend whether this is improving or not. I think we've seen it from other reports, also from New Climate, that corporates tend to be quite reactive. So it could be that they do improve significantly from one year to the next. But I think so far our analysis cannot really say, but there's interestingly also different types of targets. So it's not only the net zero, I think those are on the longer term the most interesting ones and the ones driving emissions the most, the reduction in emissions obviously, but there's also other types of targets. So companies, for example, say that they want to improve their emissions intensity, so similar to what Anna was just saying, because they already have in place maybe some energy efficiency measures or these short-term targets. No, right now we do see this link between the short-term targets and but not in the longer term. So there's that hope that they will focus on both.
Sounds good. So there is room for improvement, and we hope that in the next coming years, hopefully companies can learn from each other, and we might start to see some of those details emerging.
Yeah,
sounds good. We do actually have one question from the audience online now. Someone is asking, what role can international initiatives play in the global steel sector decarbonisation? I think that could actually be a question for either or both of you.
I'd say Maria.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. And in our report, we also have a look into what kind of initiatives there are. And we see that there are demand-side initiatives, so the ones that are asking for or that are focused on reducing emissions or that are linked to other sectors that use steel. So the car manufacturers or transport, of course, but also buildings and others, infrastructure, for example. And we saw also the supply side. So there are, I think it's a sort of positive feedback loop where the initiatives put a bit more the international pressure, and then it's also a really nice way where different kinds of actors get to work together. We've seen that some of these initiatives have, of course, corporates, so steel companies, but also have inputs from research, from academia. They work, as I said, between supply and demand. So I think it's a very positive and possible way to reduce emissions.
Of course, these steel companies are not working in their own little bubble and are connected to the rest of the world. Yeah, and thanks a lot. That's a helpful answer. We have another question, and I think this one might be targeted to you as well, Maria. What is the geographical distribution of the steel targets that you see? Are they mostly in the global north or the global south, or do you see quite a distribution globally?
I must say we looked, as I said, only in depth into the top 60 companies, and as I think what I presented in my slides, like 23 are in China already. The rest are. So maybe this is a little bit on our analysis. So steel is produced all over the world, mostly half of it in China or around half of it in China, and then other companies have plants everywhere. But it's not always super easy to do it like pointedly into the specific geographies. So our analysis includes where companies are headquartered, and that doesn't necessarily mean that emissions are happening there. So if there's a company in Luxembourg, it doesn't mean that steel is produced there, but it could be produced everywhere else. So I think it's hard to say what the distribution is between global north and south in terms of targets, but that would be something worth look at for the next forthcoming analysis. So.
Yeah, great. And thank you for the question and the ideas for research, and thanks
Yes.
Maria for your answer. We don't have any more questions coming online right now, but again, we have 1 or 2 more minutes. If you have anything to add, please do so now. Maybe while we wait, I had one question for you, Anna. You talked about how with blast furnaces, there's a real need for carbon capture and storage to actually decarbonize it if we're going to continue building them. How difficult is it to, for example, add CCUS to an existing blast furnace? Or does it have to be seen from the start, or is it possible to take that on later, and what are some of the challenges maybe?
That's a good and important question, I think. So it's technically possible to do that. Mm-hmm. Basically retrofitting an existing or old blast furnace with the carbon capture and storage. The problem is that the carbon dioxide content in the exhaust gas is quite low. So this makes it quite difficult to capture like a high rate of that carbon dioxide. So you can only reach